Good afternoon, everyone. It's great turnout, great to see everybody this afternoon, and welcome to the 2025 Milton R. Konvitz Memorial Lecture. The Milton R. Konvitz Memorial Lectureship in American Ideals has been an annual tradition at Cornell since 2006. Named in honor of the late Milton Konvitz, an ILR school founder and a leading scholar of American constitutional and labor law and civil and human rights, the lectureship brings prominent experts in American democratic thought, ethics, and political philosophy to campus. Professor Konvitz was part of the faculty both at the ILR school and at the Cornell Law School, and over the course of his long career at Cornell from 1948 to 1973, he taught more than 8,000 undergraduates in his course on American Ideals, a deep exploration of the great intellectual thinkers and philosophers who shaped American democratic values, which in turn shaped the minds and lives of many, many Cornellians. Among those many Cornellians who took that course were Irwin Jacobs, class of 54, BEE, class of 54, undergraduate, BEE 56, sorry, Irwin, and his late wife, Joan Klein Jacobs, class of 54. Two of the university's greatest philanthropists and friends who carried the Cornell ethos and drive with them throughout their lives. They have truly been exemplars of A.D. White's vision for this university and its graduates, a force for better things in our beloved country. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Jacobs' gift to create the Konvitz Lecture Series, and we're delighted to have so many members of the Jacobs family here today to celebrate. Please join me in welcoming and thanking the Jacobs family. Thank you. This year is the 20th Konvitz Lecture, and we're glad to be celebrating this milestone with a return of the inaugural speaker in this series, Cass R. Sunstein, the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard University. While Professor Sunstein did not himself attend Cornell, we still get to claim part of him as part of our extended Cornell family. Sorry, Cass, I'm going to go through a little family history here now. His father, also named Cass Sunstein, graduated from the Cornell Hotel School in 1938, and Anne Sunstein Keel, class of 36, and Ted Keel, class of 35, Law 37, were his beloved aunt and uncle. Ted Keel was a prominent and respected New York City lawyer, arbitrator, and labor mediator, and Anne was a journalist and government specialist influential in civic affairs in the city and state. Cornell's Keel Center in ILR bears their name and collects, preserves, and makes accessible special collections pertaining to the history of the workplace and labor relations. Professor Sunstein is one of the nation's foremost constitutional law scholars, a prolific author, former senior advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and husband of the writer and diplomat Samantha Power. His lecture will draw on his timely book, Campus Free Speech, a Pocket Guide, and discuss the past, present, and future of free expression at American universities. The Cornell historian Carl Becker famously said that universities don't have souls, but they do have personalities. And the Cornell personality has always been one of freedom and responsibility. At Cornell, we have enormous freedom to pursue our curiosity in any path we choose. It's a freedom that comes with a responsibility to exercise our rights in a way that respects the rights of others and the core freedoms that make free inquiry possible. Every university president who is not a constitutional scholar or a First Amendment lawyer has had a crash course in free speech and academic freedom in recent years. These issues are complex, nuanced, and incredibly important. They are the foundation stones of our system of American higher education and of our democracy. My training was in the lab, not in the law, and the years I've spent in academic administration have brought me a profound respect and appreciation for the wisdom behind the essential freedoms that underpin our university and our democracy, and they've also brought me an enormous sense of respect for the scholars who support, interpret, clarify, and share that wisdom. Today, we're privileged to have with us one of the generation's leading scholars of constitutional law and experts on campus free speech. I'm grateful for his work and for his willingness to trek to Ithaca to speak with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Cass Sunstein.
Well, it's a phenomenal honor to be here today. When I was a little boy, there were 3 words that had, a kind of resonance beyond any other words. The first and the only one of the 3 that I really understood was Santa Claus, that connoted, something's coming on December 25th. The second was Roosevelt. And I didn't have any idea what that meant, but my dad, who was a Republican, served in World War II and loved Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even though he was a Democrat. And my mother, who held the fort while my dad was fighting for the Navy in the Philippines, my mother loved Roosevelt dearly. And the third of the Holy Trinity was Cornell. And of the 3 words, the only one that made my parents' heart sing and soar was Cornell, because both of them went there. I didn't know as a little boy what Cornell was. Was it a source of presents? Was it a source of gifts? Was it a source of leadership? What was this blessed thing? But of course, it was all of those things. And in my family, and there are many Cornellians, it's widely known that Cornell has a unique character. It combines excellence that's off the charts with a character of what? Determination, moral commitment, insistence on excellence that marks it as first among the firsts. And so it's a real privilege to be here. What's the greatest sentence any Supreme Court justice ever wrote? This is a quiz, but I'm going to tell you the answer. The greatest sentence any Supreme Court justice ever wrote was, dramatic pause, a little music, compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. Pause over that, if you would. It's from Justice Robert Jackson in 1943. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. That would be the greatest sentence any Supreme Court justice ever wrote, no matter the occasion. But the occasion was a compulsory flag salute law in, guess which year, 1943, which would, you might think, be an unlikely year for the Supreme Court to say that no national or state authority might compel patriotism. And yet the court said that, emphasizing that the futility of attempts to compel obedience to a creed is the lesson of every effort from the Roman drive to stamp out Christianity, to the Inquisition, to the Siberian exiles as a means to Russian unity, down, the court wrote, to the fast-failing efforts of our present totalitarian enemies. That's 1943. Fast forward, shall we, to 2025. I'm going to be defending 3 propositions, and they're pretty simple. The first is universities are the arsenals of democracy. No pressure, My father, Cornell graduate and Navy lieutenant under horrific fire in World War II, knew that he was privileged to be part of two arsenals of democracy. One, the U.S. military, and the other is institutions of higher education. If you ask why our nation is secure, those are the two best answers, that the institutions of higher education keep a number of things afloat that make democracy powerful. Second, arsenals of democracy ought not to engage in viewpoint discrimination, whether through government compulsion or through their own voluntary action. They ought not to say that some points of view are out of bounds and to be punished for that reason. Proposition 3 of 3, universities ought not to claim that the educational mission justifies special restrictions on offensive or hurtful speech. So offensive and hurtful, green light, even if like really offensive and really hurtful. The impetus for this is we're in the midst, have you noticed, of threats from state and federal governments to regulate speech on campus by, for example, banning critical race theory or anti-patriotic speech or anti-Semitic speech, broadly understood. Those efforts could get worse. At some colleges and universities, not here, freedom of speech is under pressure from certain deeply held commitments. Some views are thought on certain campuses to be out of bounds. Maybe you can't be on the left. Maybe you're not allowed to be on the right. Maybe being in between is not authorized. Some people are punished because of what they say. Some of the restrictions come from colleges and universities themselves, some under pressure from public officials. On the part of public officials and universities, there's extraordinary uncertainty about the right approach. One problem for all of us is that uncertainty. An even deeper problem is the drawing of the wrong lines. Here is a little framework for your consideration, a proposed framework to reduce the uncertainty and prevent the drawing of wrong lines. First, to promote learning, universities aim to promote safe spaces not for feelings, but for ideas. Speech should never be restricted or punished because people, including majorities, find it distasteful, offensive, unpatriotic, wrong-headed, foolish, irreverent, cruel, or nonsensical. So that's Proposition 1. Proposition 2 of a short list of 4, this is like a little code to follow the general principles. If speech is unprotected by existing free speech principles and is inconsistent with civil or criminal law, universities need not tolerate it. Criminal conspiracy, criminal solicitation, commercial fraud, and bribery need not be welcome on campus. The same is true of direct threats, sometimes called true threats, sexual harassment, and libel as defined by law. If speech is directed to incite and likely to incite imminent lawless action, more on that in a moment, it need not be permitted. So the first proposition is a bright green light for speakers. The second is a potential red light. And we're not going to have any yellow lights, only green lights and red lights. Third, the commitment to freedom of speech doesn't mean that members of a university community may disrupt or prevent the speech of others. That's admittedly a self-serving statement by a speaker. block access to or take over buildings, disrupt classes, try to shut down campus activities, or trespass on private property. Protest activities that don't fall in those categories are acceptable. Fourth, the trickiest of the quartet, is the educational mission of the university may entail restrictions on speech designed to ensure that teachers teach and that students learn. Teachers and students may be asked to focus classroom time on the subject of their courses. Yes? Nothing inconsistent with free speech in insisting on that. And students may be asked, students, to focus their assignments and examinations on the subject of the course. But this educational mission idea, and here I'm going against a certain grain, is a narrow point, not a broad one, because it was either Bob Dylan or William Shakespeare, I don't know which of those two Nobel Prize winners, said, "That way lies madness." So broad conceptions of the educational mission as a license for restricting speech is a potential horror movie in which everybody in the end dies. Okay. It will be noticed that I'm putting a lot of weight here on the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and existing principles. It might be noticed that Cornell is a private university, like Boston College and Stanford and Brown, are not bound by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So if Brown says we are woke here or we are left here and certain kinds of speech are not welcome, that does not offend the First Amendment, not because the First Amendment is relaxed or loosened, but because it doesn't apply at all. Some people find that surprising. It's the case. The suggestion is that bringing on board First Amendment principles is the best path forward because it does something which it's beautiful to see done, said the longtime University of Chicago faculty member. It reduces the costs of decisions and the costs of errors. And before you think, to whom are you listening? Who would think that's a beautiful thing? When things get hard, it's often useful to think of a framework that minimizes the number and terribleness of mistakes and that makes life easy rather than miserable. Yes, is that familiar? If you have a framework that says do what's reasonable under the circumstances, then life is going to be very hard to navigate because that's going to produce dispute every time there's disagreement about a situation. If you have a speed limit law that says don't go over 65, then life is manageable. The First Amendment, I suggest, applied to private institutions all over our country, has the advantage of making life a lot simpler and also has the advantage of making life a lot better because existing First Amendment principles are something to celebrate and to bring on board with pride and gratitude rather than something to deplore and struggle with. Okay, that's the text, but as many of you know, footnotes for law papers typically are a lot longer than text. So now, are you prepared to hear the footnotes? They're not that long, but here are the footnotes. What you might be thinking if speech is hateful? What if it's likely to produce violence? What if it might produce unlawful action, such as a takeover of a building? I referred to the Supreme Court's test, which is that public institutions may punish speech that's directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. Get the formulation? It's an elaboration of the clear and present danger test, where clear turns into likely and present turns into imminent. Notice that if speech runs afoul of that test, it can be punished or stopped. It's crucial to see there are 4 elements here. There has to be a likelihood that the lawless action will occur. The speech has to intend that it occur. The speaker has to want it to occur. It has to be imminent, and it has to be lawless. If someone says, if you don't buy my campus free speech book, there's going to be, forgive the term, hell to pay, or if someone says something about the Middle East that is extremely provocative and inflammatory, it's highly unlikely that either of those things is regulable, because the likelihood of violence occurring has to be over 50%, and it probably isn't, because imminence probably isn't there, which is to say that this is a firmly speech protective test, which means that even if violence is likely to occur, but the speaker doesn't intend to incite it, there's no basis for restriction. This is both a green light and a red light to regulation of speech. This idea is sufficient to show that certain categories of speech aren't protected by the free speech principle at all. A little kind of trick for the non-lawyers in the room. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, and a famous Supreme Court justice thought that was an absolute. What part of no law abridging do you not understand? That's not a convincing argument, because we need to know what the freedom of speech is and what a law abridging is. And a prohibition on perjury or commercial fraud might not be a law that abridges the freedom of speech. And in fact, for a long time, laws of that sort weren't even thought possibly to abridge those things. So the text of the First Amendment invites discussion. It's not right to say that it reads like an absolute. It reads like a text that demands further thought. The further thought, as free speech law now stands, allows restrictions on defamation and libel, subject to prevailing standards, sexual harassment, properly defined, perjury, child pornography, and fraud. There's no constitutional right to plagiarize or to use Grok or ChatGPT to write papers or exam answers. That's sad news for all of us, but there we go. Why is some speech unprotected? There's no uniform theory, but the basic idea is simple. Some speech has low value in the sense that its connection to the purposes for which the First Amendment was ratified is weak. If someone says, I'm going to punch you in the nose if I see you again, the connection between that statement and democratic self-government is non-existent. If someone says, if I see you, I'm going to hit you and I don't want you around here, that true threat has little connection with the autonomy of the speaker. It's more a statement of rage than a reflection of autonomy. It's also the case that the unprotected categories of speech typically give rise to a serious threat of harm, as in the case of commercial fraud or perjury or lying to the government on a job application. And the combination of low value in terms of free speech purposes and high harm in terms of self-evident analysis justifies a conclusion that these forms of speech are not protected. That's a really important conclusion. It suggests that universities, like everyone else, are allowed to punish unprotected speech, and many cases are going to be really easy, whatever the university. Okay, we're building up the framework and things are going to get increasingly complicated. There was developed with astonishing recency, roughly in the 1970s and 80s, a framework that distinguishes among three categories of restrictions on speech, and what I'm about to describe is an extraordinary achievement of case-by-case judgment on the Supreme Court of the United States. Some restrictions on speech are content neutral. For example, you're not allowed to play loud music at any time between 12 midnight and 4 a.m. The content of the speech is irrelevant. It could be Olivia Rodrigo, in which case the restriction is especially horrifying, or because we like her, right? Yes. Or it could be the Kinks, in which case the restriction is kind of bad but not horrifying, but it doesn't matter. So the content of speech is irrelevant to the application of the restriction. Then there are other restrictions on speech that are content-based but viewpoint neutral. Here's one. Suppose the government said that Cornell must be viewpoint neutral in its policies with respect to students and faculty. We'll return to that tough one. I hope you're finding it tough. But notice, if you would, that any restriction, any mandate of viewpoint neutrality is content-based. It's not content neutral. So if there's a university where everyone's left of center and the government says that can't continue, then that is a content-based restriction on speech. It may or may not be viewpoint-based. At first glance, a requirement of viewpoint neutrality is viewpoint neutral, but content-based. If that's unclear, if it said you can't discuss the President of the United States, that is content-based, but viewpoint neutral. Yes? A viewpoint-based restriction, by contrast, is necessarily content-based, but it also has the unwelcome feature of punishing people of a certain point of view. So if you say you can't criticize Israel with respect to current events, that's viewpoint-based as well as content-based. If it says you can't say anything negative about the president, that's viewpoint-based, not just content-based. As the law now stands, viewpoint-based restrictions are almost per se invalid. Content-based restrictions face a strong presumption of invalidity, and content-neutral restrictions are subjected to a more generous, lenient test, which asks basically, does the government have a strong interest in protecting against the evil that it invokes? And is there a way of achieving that goal without restricting speech so much? And is the restriction on speech devastating to speakers or merely inconvenient and annoying to speakers? To particularize, are no loud noises between midnight and 4 a.m. is justified because sleep is really important. Might we agree with that? Is not that terrible to speakers because they get lots of other hours in which to say things, and which the achievement of the government's goal, which is to try to protect people in their ability to sleep, is very hard to obtain except through this kind of restriction. We could imagine more difficult ones in which a content-based restriction is more content-neutral restriction is more draconian. If there are no speeches allowed or loud speeches allowed, let's say, except between the hours of 12 noon and 1 p.m., that's much harder to defend. It's much more aggressive restriction on speakers. So now we have a framework which we can bring to bear, which will answer most of our questions. The widespread current interest in requiring viewpoint-neutral decision-making is an interestingly brain-teasy one. I think it's a tough one for the government to win. First, because the requirement of viewpoint neutrality is clearly content-based. Second, in application, it's going to get viewpoint-based in a hurry. If you have a history department that, let's say, has all left-of-center people, it would be reasonable to say, well, what about right-of-center people in the interest of viewpoint neutrality? Fair, but what if the history department has no Marxists? What if it has no one who believes that the Holocaust didn't happen? What if it has no one who takes a very far left view of history? What if it has no historians who follow Ayn Rand or Milton Friedman? And the easy proliferation of questions suggests that in implementing a requirement of viewpoint neutrality, any public official is very quickly going to be favoring certain viewpoints. Is this clear? It's going to be very difficult, which suggests that the brain teaser is one that the government is going to have a challenging time defending if it ever gets there. Okay, now we're going to get to the hardest one as we march up the hill, and that's the educational mission. things get here really interesting and really complicated. I've had 3 stints in the government. If in my second stint, where I was overseeing government regulation, there's a government office that does that in the Executive Office of the President, and if I said, I'm really liking my job, but the President's views on regulation are terrible, and it's really hard for me to kind of go into work every day knowing my boss is so wrong, if the President fired me, there'd be no constitutional problem. The reason is the President can say, in order to be my employee, you kind of have to be basically, at least publicly, on board with me. Or if someone at the University of California at Berkeley says, I'm the head of admissions at the University of California at Berkeley and I love my job, but boy do I hate the admissions policies that I have to implement. They are, and then you can end the sentence however you like, they are too focused on legacies, too focused on sports, too focused on race, insufficiently focused on race. And if Berkeley says to the admissions officer, I'm sorry, you can't do this job anymore, that's almost certainly constitutionally okay, because as in the case of the high-level government official who, in order to do his job, might be required to act and speak consistently with the views of his boss. So there is a degree of authority any institution has over its own employees to make sure they're doing something, they're saying things that are compatible with the institution's mission. So let's just say universities should be allowed to regulate speech if the regulation is genuinely essential to the mission of the university. To insist that law professors teaching constitutional law focus on constitutional law, not climate change, is any dean of any law school would be pleased to hear, though he or she probably already knows it, constitutionally unobjectionable. Here's a less simple example that we would have to work with to figure out exactly what it means, but let's start with the first order conclusion. A university can insist that professors treat their students with respect, and if a professor is not treating students with respect, a university can say the First Amendment doesn't have a disrespect exception, but to be a professor at our university, you have to treat your students with respect. That's probably okay. A somewhat concerning implication is that the restriction on content discrimination has to be approached with some caution in the university setting, and the same is even true for the presumption against viewpoint discrimination. If a student answers a history test with an essay on the gravity of the climate crisis, a professor can flunk that student. That's viewpoint neutral, but content-based. If an English professor would like to discuss current events rather than Shakespeare in a course on Shakespeare, you know how the sentence ends? It's okay. You can say this is a course on Shakespeare. Here's a tougher one, which the University of Pennsylvania has struggled with. This is going to be a variation on it. If a math professor believes that men are better than women at math and that women struggle with math, there's an argument that the teacher can be directed not to say that in class on the ground that if he does so, he won't be able to do his job. Clear? It's fine to say women are better at X or men are better at Y, but for a teacher of a subject to say that in a way that puts female students at a disadvantage in the class, that's reasonably deemed a problem. There's a difference between what professors may say in class and what they may say out of class. I'm building a little argument against my main conclusions here, and you won't be surprised here I'm going to try to rescue the conclusions, but I'm giving the alternative view a fair shot. Here's a more provocative one. Suppose a law school is hiring a new faculty member to teach constitutional law. There are two finalists for the position. One believes that the meaning of the Constitution is settled by the original public meaning, as Justice Thomas believes, so this is an originalist. The other is not an originalist. The one who dislikes originalism is left of center and favors a different methodology. The faculty hires the originalist, let's suppose, on the ground that she would add intellectual diversity to the institution, which has, let's stipulate, few conservatives and only one originalist among several dozen professors. I'm hoping the hypothetical is clear, and it could be extended to history departments, psychology departments, economic departments, etc. There's an extremely good argument the law school has not violated free speech principles. An institution is allowed to pursue intellectual diversity. Sure, it's engaged in a degree of viewpoint discrimination, but in this context, that form of viewpoint discrimination isn't invidious. A central goal of the viewpoint discrimination in this case is to enlarge viewpoint diversity at the university as a whole, and that's okay. That suggests the educational enterprise permits institutions to impose restrictions that would not be acceptable if imposed by the national government in order to carry out their mission. Okay, what I'm doing here is operating kind of like a plumber, trying to figure out how to break, forgive the word, how to fix a broken toilet, not to be adventurous. I'm operating within the boundaries of existing law. But today's boundaries can become tomorrow's open field, and many people think the educational mission has much larger implications that I'm going to allow. So what we're going to focus now is on a brilliant analysis by Robert Post, former dean of Yale Law School, who wants to give certain permission slips to universities that my argument thus far would deny, and the arguments he's giving to universities would be available to state and local governments too, I think, if his argument is correct. So let's listen to him. Post urges that free speech principles are designed for public discourse and the formation of public opinion. So think the Revolutionary War, think the independence of the United States as codified in the Declaration and the Constitution. On his account, we are not the free authors of our own government, we the people. A republic if you can keep it, said Franklin to an observer who asked, "What have you given us?" We are not the free authors of our own government if we are compelled to participate in the formation of public opinion in a manner that is contrary to our own will. So that's free speech principles. Post urges that those principles aren't designed for and just don't fit Cornell or Stanford or Boston College or Oberlin. The purpose of classic First Amendment principles is to protect the process of self-government. That's noble. Speech within universities serves a different purpose. It serves the purpose of education, which requires an entirely different framework of speech regulation and protection. This is post-submission. Speech within campus is ordinarily protected according to principles of academic freedom as distinct from freedom of speech. So this is a dichotomy. Freedom of teaching is not about self-government. Is it about education? Free speech principles of the sort that I'm seeking to bring to bear on his account being overextended. Okay, that argument is on firm ground insofar as it suggests that the distinctiveness of the educational mission is relevant to an assessment of whether restrictions on speech are permissible. We would, for sure, overextend First Amendment principles if we said that universities can't insist that professors teach students treat students with respect, and if we insist that students obey certain norms of civility. We'd have to specify those, but that's okay. But it doesn't follow that we should jettison classic First Amendment principles in favor of principles of academic freedom. For one thing, it's not clear that principles of academic freedom have constitutional status. That's not clear. Principles of freedom of speech do. They might support principles of academic freedom, but academic freedom has a less than obvious relationship to the U.S. Constitution. The more fundamental point, maybe, is if we jettison free speech principles, the core safeguards in our arsenals of democracy are in the garbage can. Free speech would be at risk in a place where it most needs to flourish. Sure, the ban on viewpoint discrimination can't always be firm in the university setting, but still the ban on viewpoint discrimination is usually firm in the university setting and essential, which is a brisk way of saying the classic principles need to be retained. Those principles don't, mind you, merely protect self-government as such, and mathematicians and artists and singers in the room, novelists, poets, take cheer. Self-government is a defining value, no doubt about it, maybe the core value, but free speech principles go far beyond that. They protect poets, actors, artists, novelists. They also protect students, faculty, and administrators, even in the face of plausible, but in the end unconvincing references to the educational mission. So, it follows there are tons and tons of easy cases where free speech claims by student protesters are convincing. There are numerous easy cases in which claims of free speech protection by student protesters are very weak. If a group of students say to an individual whom they despise, if we see you again, your nose is going to be bloody, we don't want your type here, that's not protected by the First Amendment. If there's a content-neutral restriction designed to protect spaces from expressive activity, chances are very good that that's okay. We know why the hard cases are hard. They involve contentious uses of the educational mission to protect against, let's say, humiliating, degrading, or genuinely frightening speech. In some of those cases, reasonable people can differ, and recognizing that is progress. Free speech, I'm submitting, ought to get the benefit of doubt in cases in which the reasonable people are at odds. Okay, that's basically all I have to say, but there's an epilogue. If there's one thing I'd like you to remember, it's the set of principles implementing the commitment to free speech in our beloved country is a miracle. It's a triumph of the human spirit. Shall I say that just an hour ago, I was at the Kiel Center, my aunt and uncle, and the host there showed me a letter from Albert Einstein from 1953. Who knew? A letter from Albert Einstein in 1953. In the midst of a period of threat to academic freedom in the United States. And Einstein, who knew about this stuff from Germany, said to professors, here's what you need to do. Stand firm, even if your livelihood and life are at stake. Okay? The principles that allow Einstein to say that and that make it so that those of us who insist on the relevant principles don't have our life and livelihood at stake Those principles aren't fundamentally a product of the founding generation or even the Civil War period. They have continuity with those, but they're not a product of those. They've been built basically since the 1940s. Norms of mutual respect and considerateness are massively important, but they are norms, not laws. Whether public or private, America's institutions of higher learning, the envy of nations all over the globe, those institutions ought to permit members of their communities to say things that are horrifying, disruptive, or enraging. The best response to errors and to offensive or horrifying speech, as Justice Brandeis said long ago, is not a threat of punishment, but more speech. Colleges and universities exist for one reason. Really, this is it. The only one. Everything else is kind of the second and third paragraph. To promote learning. That's why, along with the military, you all are located in democracy's greatest arsenal. What a privilege, by the way. Freedom ought to be ringing on public streets, in public parks, and on campus. What universities don't need is the unanimity of the graveyard. What they need instead is curious, teeming, and occasionally noisy pluralism. The curious, teeming, and occasionally noisy pluralism of living communities trying to figure out what's true. Thanks.
Do we have some time for questions, or are there questions from the audience?
Sir.
I think independent of, or this applies to all departments, so I don't mean it to be political in any way. I think this time of the university could be characterized by the unanimity of the graveyard, that there's too much conformity. And for that reason, we truly need free speech. And I just ask you to comment.
Can I tell you that I have two kind of poster-ish things on my office door. One is called Pray for Surf, which is kind of lame. It's from an LA friend who reminded me I'm kind of away from surf. The other is from Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist who kept being asked in response to some really hard questions, and he said, I don't know. And the person who was engaging with him got increasingly frustrated and finally said, you don't know, what do you think? And he said, and this is what's on my door, it's not a matter of thinking, it's an empirical question, I don't have the data. That's good, yes? So the idea that we are in the midst of unanimity of the graveyard at institutions of higher education, that's an empirical claim, yes, and I lack the data. Can I talk a little bit around it, if I may? So I've been at Cornell I've been privileged to visit Cornell a few times in the last years. And the diversity of opinion every time I've been here has been like oxygen. So when I was here first for free speech discussion a number of years ago, I was privileged to be here to give this talk, and I'm counting on being invited back in 20 years. I'm finally going to get it right. Both in informal discussions and more formal settings, people think different things and will say different things. And at institutions, I know, institutions that are very famous and institutions that are not at all famous, students think different things. So, and we'll say different things. Now, I'm teaching a course right now where there are students who think the right-wing justices on the court are excellent and point the path forward. And there are students who think the left-wing justices on the court are almost always right. And they engage with each other. So if it's the case that if there's literally the unanimity of the graveyard, then it would be gruesome and horrifying. And if there's the functional equivalent, it wouldn't be quite so gruesome, but it would be horrifying. And what Tom Hanks, remember he was an astronaut before he was an actor. Do you remember that? Didn't he say when he was in Apollo 13, Houston, we have a problem? Or was he an actor even then? Okay, so Houston, we'd have a problem. So I agree with the moral force of the argument, and let's hope if it's true, it's decreasingly true. Yeah.
So, guys, in your talk, you refer to the university, but the university is a they, not an it, right? So there are decisions taken at the trustee level, state university, there could be pressure from the governor or the legislature, there's the president, professional administration, there's faculty governance. I wonder whether your principles have different application depending on what level of the university makes it. And at least one example you gave suggests the answer should be yes, right? That is, you say that the law school could decide for its own interests in intellectual diversity to hire the originalists rather than the non-originalists, but you're skeptical that the government could impose that on the university. If you imagine a university that's governed in part by government officials, how would that play out? So I'm just sort of interested in your general take on that.
Okay, so that's great. If a history department says we don't have enough people who are celebrating American traditions, and my son who's 16 is reading a book in a school saying everything you learned in history courses was wrong, something like that. It's a famous book, and it's very left of center. And if a history department decides we have too many people who think that, we want the other, it follows from my argument that that's okay. If the government imposes it, so you're quite right, the question is, what is the government doing? What's the form of words the government is using? To have a content, and this gets tricky, a content-based regulation from the government in the interest of viewpoint diversity would need to meet a burden of justification, which it would struggle to do, I say. So I guess it does follow from my argument that the local institution has more autonomy to pursue content, to engage in content discriminatory stuff than the nation. Now, I'm not sure that's right. So if the state of, let's have a random example, Florida, says something about diversity of view, which is motivated by instances like the history and law cases I gave, can we make that case harder than I think? Maybe so. You see why I think it's hard, that it's content discrimination and what's the justification, and it's going to become an application viewpoint discrimination. So it might be that I'm implicitly building on a notion of academic freedom. I'd like not to do that, but it might be that the intuition does that. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Hi, I was actually a student of Milton Konvitz, Uncle Milty. Probably his last course on constitutional law. Still have the book and had the privilege of then working for Bella Abzug in Congress, covering the Supreme Court based upon everything I learned at the ILR school. What I wanted to come back to when you're talking about the present day, and if you have a university that has students that is a bona fide student accepted, is not taking over a building, but on protest on a private campus, but by the attention they get, as we've seen, the government comes in and pulls them away and throws them out of the country, and then the university is not sure what they have the right to do because they could be threatened with loss of funds. Can you put that in perspective as something we're dealing with like right now?
I think the honest answer to your question is no. So you said, could I put this perspective, in this perspective, everyone heard in light of right now? This is a question about my own capacities, and my answer is, I doubt it, but I'm willing to try. So the first question is the government's action inconsistent with the Constitution? So if the government is deporting people who have one point of view, but not people who have another point of view, the government had better explain what's the reason. Maybe it has an adequate reason. If it's punishing people who are non-Americans because of their speech, then we have to ask what kinds of rights do non-Americans on our soil have? Some rights, so there we go. If the government is saying you can't stay here if you engage in certain actions, it might be that the government's authority over who gets to stay here is subject to weaker First Amendment restrictions than would be imposed on people who are American citizens or not subject to that. Now, I think at first, surely the government has more authority over speakers whom it gives visas to than it has over American citizens. I think we have to be able to think of cases in which that proposition would be irresistible, pretty sure. But it wouldn't be that if you get a visa to come here, you can be deported because you haven't agreed to sing Olivia Rodrigo songs every night. That would be too implausibly, much as I admire her, too implausibly associated with any legitimate government interest. So that's the direction the analysis would go. On the university's own role, if its students are being, first, suppose the government isn't doing anything unlawful, but doing something that the university is very alarmed by, then there are things that are alarming and not unlawful that the university can make a prudential judgment about whether to try to do anything about. And that would depend on a set of considerations that are pretty self-evident. If the government is doing something unlawful, then there's also a prudential judgment where there's a good argument for the university to protect its own people in the face of illegal government action. And the obligatory words, after consultation with counsel.
I took Dr. Konvitz for 2 of his American Ideal classes, and I just wanted to mention that what I took away from his teachings and why he viewed free speech as so important, the basis of it all was the sanctity of the individual. He liked to say that God made man a little less than the angels. So the government was there to protect the sanctity of the individual. Religious teachings of the West were focused on the sanctity of the individual. But I thought that that was the message and the reason why the free speech is important to him.
Okay, so this is a deep question. John Rawls, the great philosopher, had a footnote he put in a manuscript he never published. And the footnote said, we post a signpost, no deep thinking here. Things are bad enough already. So with respect to universities and free speech, there's a lot of progress can be made without asking the most fundamental questions of all. And I want to make a plea for that, that often we can decide how to handle very hard problems amidst disagreement about the fundamentals or uncertainty about the fundamentals. Yes? So we can all agree, I hope, that freedom of religion is very important, where some people believe it's God's will, and other people believe that it's a reflection of the sanctity of the individual, and other people believe we've got to find a way to live together, and it has kind of, it's socially essential for mutually agreeable whatevers. And so the sanctity of the individual is a contentious understanding of what the free speech principle is grounded in. It might be the right one. There's another that is very prominent in our culture, which is it's connected with Republican self-government. And the free speech principle is, and this is what Post is urging, that it's associated with what we fought the war for independence for. The sanctity of the individual outruns the self-government idea and is a better guide to practice in the sense that lots of speech that has nothing to do with public affairs is indeed protected by the First Amendment. Whether that's because of the sanctity of the individual for some other reason. There's hard theoretical issues here. There was a lawyer, philosopher named Fred Schauer, a very distinguished one, who wanted to know, is speech special? What's the distinctive feature of it that gives it its place? And he struggled with, he thought that was a hard question, because if you believe in the sanctity of the individual, there are also other things you might need to believe that you would be uncomfortable also believing. And so the grounding, that might be the right way to ground free speech. It makes it hard to make some distinctions we'd like to make, maybe. Would you, if you believe in the sanctity of the individual, would you allow regulation of obscenity? The Supreme Court allows regulation of obscenity narrowly defined on the ground that it isn't closely associated with the values that the First Amendment stands for, and it's harmful enough, something like that, but an emphasis on values. So the sanctity of the individual might be a little rebellious with respect to existing law, but Thomas Jefferson, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing.
Thank you for your talk. You just mentioned the importance of diversity, but some people may complain that nowadays the university itself is not so diversity. Do you say it's true? The second question related to the first one is, if that is true, should we do something, maybe regulation or maybe something else to address the issue about the diversity to ensure we have such a diversity?
Okay, so I didn't quite get the first. Is it that some universities don't have enough viewpoint diversity, and I agree with that, but I don't want the government to mandate it, so what should we do? Okay, so I think the idea that universities don't have sufficient viewpoint diversity has a lot of force, but to think about its meaning is head spinning. So if you agree with the statement that there's at least one university in the United States that lacks sufficient viewpoint diversity, that has to be true. Not this one. There has to be at least one that doesn't have sufficient. What does that mean? I think the people who say that typically mean it's too left of center. They don't mean Brigham Young. Where are the Marxists at Brigham Young? Maybe there are some. They don't mean to say that at Notre Dame we don't have enough atheists. So the claim that there's not enough viewpoint diversity is actually, it's very specific, and the statement isn't capturing. If the claim is that universities are too left-leaning, I agree with that. I think that's true. But to say universities need to be more right-leaning, for the government to say that, now we're talking viewpoint discrimination big time. So to say that Brown has to hire right-of-center people, that's viewpoint discrimination. And the notion of viewpoint neutrality sounds more neutral than actually the thesis is. So I'm just a lawyer, so the question, what would I do about those universities that don't have enough right-of-center people? I'd hire more right-of-center people. I think that's a very good thing to do. And, some places are aware that this is a good thing to do and are doing that.